Thus far, we have used AWS Console to develop and deploy our Lambda functions. This is not how you would want to actually produce software, because you'd want to use Git to collaborate with other people. You'd want to run your code through tests and pipelines. Today, we're going to explore better ways of developing your Lambda functions. Serverless Framework is a tool for deploying your cloud infrastructure and code. It's especially good for deploying AWS Lambdas and the APIs that use the Lambdas as a backend. Let's start by installing it. npm install serverless-g. This installs serverless globally to our machine so that we can use the serverless command. Next off, let us use the serverless command to create a project from the Hello World template. Whoop! That created us serverless YAML file, handler.js file, and gitignore file. In handler.js file, we have our JavaScript code that works as our API backend. In serverless YAML file, we have configuration for deploying that handler to an API. Service name here defines the name of our project. Provider is set to AWS because serverless can also be used with other cloud providers. Runtime is set to Node.js 6. Let's fix that quick to Node.js 8. That's much better. The name of our function, Lambda function, will be Hello World, and the handler for handling any invocations of this Lambda will be handler.helloworld, meaning this handler file here, and this handler file exports a function named Hello World. Thus, handler.helloworld is our handler. The events here defines our API gateway API, and the HTTP defines that the API will get HTTP requests, and the path is hello world with method get. To use serverless, you're gonna need to set up a service account so that serverless has access to your AWS. When trying to use serverless, it will link you to this page. In this page, you will have the instructions for creating access key by adding a user, and you will get an API key and secret. I recommend you install AWS CLI and you run the AWS configure command and set up your access key and secret. Then they will be stored into this AWS credentials file, which all the AWS tools and serverless know how to use, and you will have easy time accessing your AWS account. Let's deploy our API. I'll write SLS, which is just short for the serverless command, and deploy. Haha, it finally finished. Let's see what happened. It packaged our services and created stack. Now what is a stack? In the AWS console, we can search for CloudFormation or just stack, and it will find CloudFormation for us. Our stack will be in CloudFormation, but we actually deployed to North Virginia. That is the default region that serverless and AWS mostly use. You have to specifically define different region if you're not deploying to North Virginia. So going to North Virginia, we can see our stack here. Serverless Hello World is the service name that we defined, and it's suffixed by dev. Dev is the stage name. In serverless, the default stage is dev. We can also have various other stages like prod and beta, etc. The stage is used to separate our different deployments. Going into the stack, we can see that we deployed stack. In this stack, we deployed API gateway, we deployed a Lambda function, and we deployed various other permissions and roles, etc. Let us see the API gateway and Lambda that we created. The API gateway is here. The Lambda is here. In the first episode, we created an API for our pizza factory. Now that API has allowed our factory to run with an almost unimaginable efficiency. What do we do when we have large quantities of nearly free pizza? Our next logical step is to start turning that pizza into biofuel. And for that we are going to need a power plant API. The service name for our API will be Pizza Power Plant. It will be hosted in AWS, run on Node.js 8.10, and the region will be EU West 2, which is London. The function name will be show pizza. Handler will be show pizza dot handler. That makes the file name show pizza.js, and it needs to export a function name handler. It will have a HTTP GET method called show pizza. Now let us deploy this. In the serverless log output, we conveniently get the link that we need to follow to open our endpoint. We are getting Go serverless 1 function executed successfully. That's what we returned from our handler. Now we need to return instead the pizza that we created in the first episode. Currently we have two functions, the pizza place we created in the first episode and our current pizza power plant. Copy our code. The code in our previous Lambda looks a bit different from the code we have here in our serverless function. That's because by default the serverless creates a Lambda proxy function, which just means that the Lambda can freely define the status code, headers, etc., while what we were using before does more work on the API gateway to define these things in the response. Serverless prefers to use this format because it's much easier to really control what your Lambda is returning when you just have all this logic in your Lambda instead of somewhere else. We'll want to give out this whole response, but instead of the Go serverless one, we want to return our pizza. Therefore, in here, I will just return the pizza. And instead of returning instantly, I want to still keep the 2-second delay. So we will call the callback here. Let us deploy. Again, this time it should be much faster since we already have the stack created. All we need to do is really just update this one function. But as you can see, it's still not that fast. And in our endpoint, we get pizza pepperoni. And loading this takes a couple of seconds. I feel like you have fairly good understanding now about how using Serverless Framework works in practice. So let's talk a little bit. It's an infrastructure as code tool. That means that you will write down the infrastructure that you want to have in your AWS. Then you will give serverless the infrastructure that you wrote down using the serverless deploy command. Then serverless will check the running infrastructure and see the difference between the running infrastructure and your definition. And it will do whatever is necessary to bring the running infrastructure to your definition. Surprisingly, Serverless Framework is not the only infrastructure as code tool. There are other fantastic tools such as Terraform. Though Serverless Framework is excellent for updating your lambdas and your API such as API Gateway or AppSync. Don't forget to subscribe and comment if you have any input.